The park was unusually quiet that afternoon. The late autumn wind gusted through the trees, sending cascades of golden leaves swirling down to the ground. It was the kind of day that seemed to carry the weight of something unsaid, a day when the world felt both vast and eerily still. The distant sound of traffic and city life only added to the sense of isolation that hung over the small, forgotten park. Timmy, the boy on the bench, sat hunched over, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. His face was hidden, pressed into his arms, as if retreating from a world that had given him nothing but sorrow. His clothes were faded, too small and full of patches. His sneakers, once white, were now caked with mud, the soles peeling away. The cold had started to creep into his bones, but he didn't move. He couldn't. To the people passing by, he was invisible, an afterthought in a world where time was money and compassion was often a luxury few could afford. A mother walked by, tugging her children along, too preoccupied with her phone to notice. An elderly man shuffled past, casting a brief, pitying glance in Timmy's direction before moving on. Nobody stopped. From across the street, Richard Langston stood with the keys to his black luxury car in hand. He had just finished a meeting, the kind of deal that made him more money in a single afternoon than most people earned in a year. His tailored coat hugged his broad shoulders, his shoes polished to a perfect shine. He adjusted his silk scarf as he locked the car, already thinking about his next appointment, his mind swimming with figures and deadlines. But then he heard it, a muffled sob that cut through the noise of the city. His eyes drifted toward the park, narrowing on the small figure sitting alone on the bench. At first, Richard hesitated. He wasn't the type to involve himself in the affairs of strangers, especially not the kind of strangers who cried on park benches. His world was one of boardrooms, stock portfolios, and penthouse views. But something about the scene tugged at him. The boy's shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of more than just temporary sadness. It was a kind of hopelessness that Richard, in all his success, had never known. The urge to walk away was strong. After all, what could a man like him do? But another deeper part of him, the part he rarely listened to, urged him to cross the street. Richard took a breath, shoving his hands into his coat pockets, and made his way toward the boy. As he neared, the wind picked up again, carrying the boy's soft, broken sobs toward him. They were the sounds of someone completely overwhelmed by the weight of their world. He stopped just a few feet from the bench, unsure of what to say. Richard wasn't good with emotions. His life had been built on control and calculation. But here, in the face of such raw despair, all his business acumen seemed irrelevant. Slowly he knelt down, putting himself at eye level with the child. "Hey, buddy," Richard said, his voice gentler than he expected. "Are you okay?" There was no response. The boy's sobs only grew louder, as though acknowledging the question had unleashed a flood of emotions he could no longer contain. His face stayed hidden in his arms, as if the weight of the world had broken him, leaving him too tired to even lift his head. Richard didn't push him. Instead, he sat down on the bench beside him, the wood cold and hard beneath him. The boy's cries filled the silence between them, and for a moment, neither spoke. Richard could feel the eyes of those passing by on him now, their curious glances trying to figure out what a man like him was doing, sitting next to a crying child in the park. But Richard didn't care. He wasn't thinking about them. His mind was racing, trying to figure out what could make a boy so young cry like that. Was he lost? Had something terrible happened to his family? Or was it something deeper, a pain that ran beneath the surface, the kind that no amount of comfort could easily heal? "Look, I don't know what's wrong, but maybe I can help," Richard said, his tone awkward but sincere. "Is there someone I can call? Your parents?" The boy's body stiffened at the word parents, and for the first time, Richard saw a reaction. Slowly, the boy lifted his head, revealing a tear-streaked face and red puffy eyes. His lip trembled as he tried to speak, but all that came out was a small, choking sound. Richard's chest tightened. He wasn't prepared for this. He had expected a simple problem, maybe a lost wallet or a fight with a friend. But the look on the boy's face told him that whatever was wrong, it was far more serious. "What's your name?" Richard asked, hoping to break through the wall of emotion that surrounded the boy. The boy wiped his nose with the sleeve of his tattered jacket, his voice barely a whisper. "Timmy! Timmy! Okay, that's a good start," Richard said, offering a small, reassuring smile. Can you tell me what happened? For a moment, Timmy didn't respond. His eyes drifted down to his hands, which were clenched tightly in his lap, the knuckles white with tension. Then, with a shaky breath, he began to speak. "It's my family," Timmy said, his voice trembling. We don't have enough money for food. My mom, she's sick. She's been in bed for weeks, and I don't know what to do. My dad, he left us, and it's just me and my sisters now." The words came out in a rush, as though they had been bottled up inside for too long. Each sentence seemed to break another piece of Timmy's fragile composure, and soon the tears were flowing freely again. Richard felt a sharp pang of sympathy. He wasn't used to feeling this way, helpless, unsure of what to do. But there was something about Timmy's situation that resonated with him. He had worked hard to build his fortune, but he had never known the kind of desperation that Timmy was describing. He had never been in a position where survival was a daily struggle. Richard reached out, placing a comforting hand on Timmy's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Timmy. That's a lot for you to handle on your own." Timmy nodded, wiping at his tears with his sleeve. "I just don't know what to do anymore. I tried to ask for help, but no one listens. No one cares." Richard's jaw tightened. He had spent his life surrounded by people who only cared about wealth and success. But here, in front of him, was a boy who didn't care about any of that. He just wanted someone to notice his pain. "Well, I care," Richard said, his voice firm. "And I'm going to help you, Timmy. We're going to figure this out, okay?" Timmy looked up at him, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You mean it?" "I do," Richard said, nodding. "You don't have to go through this alone." For the first time, Timmy managed a small, hopeful smile. And in that moment, Richard knew that helping this boy was the most important thing he could do. Before continuing, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This really helps a lot and allows us to keep bringing you more amazing content. Your support makes all the difference to us. Now let's continue. The wind had shifted, growing colder, as Richard sat beside Timmy on the bench. The once faint scent of rain now hung heavily in the air, a sign that a storm was fast approaching. Timmy had quieted down, his sobs turning into silent sniffles. His hands trembled as he wiped the last of his tears away with the sleeve of his ragged jacket. Richard didn't rush him. He knew that pushing too hard could close the boy off even more. He just waited, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city. After what felt like an eternity, Timmy finally spoke again. His voice was raw, barely more than a whisper, as though every word took tremendous effort. "I don't know what to do anymore." Richard leaned forward slightly, offering a comforting presence. "Take your time, Timmy. I'm here. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." Timmy lifted his gaze, his tear-streaked face revealing the exhaustion and helplessness of someone far older than his years. His eyes, still red and puffy from crying, were filled with a pain that was difficult to face. "It's my family," he said, his voice trembling. We're not doing good." A knot formed in Richard's stomach as he realized this wasn't just about a bad day or a schoolyard fight. The way Timmy spoke, it was the tone of someone who had been carrying an impossible weight for far too long. "What's going on with your family?" Richard asked carefully, though he already sensed the answer would be something much darker than he anticipated. Timmy's shoulders slumped as though they were caving under an invisible burden. He took a deep breath, and for a brief moment, he looked like he might break down again. But then he forced himself to speak. "It's my mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's really sick. She can't get out of bed most days, and we don't have any money to take her to a doctor. I've been trying to help her, but I don't know what to do. I'm just a kid." His words came out in a rush, the dam of his emotions finally breaking. Richard's heart sank further with each sentence. Timmy wasn't just facing a difficult situation. He was battling a nightmare. And the worst part was, he was doing it alone. "Where's your dad?" Richard asked, already dreading the answer. Timmy's expression darkened, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "He left us. He just walked out one day and didn't come back. That was a year ago. Since then, it's just been me and my sisters trying to take care of everything. But it's hard. My mom can't work, and I'm too young to get a job, so there's no money for food or medicine. Some days, we don't eat at all." The weight of Timmy's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Richard felt a wave of anger rise within him, not at Timmy, but at the world that had allowed a child to shoulder such a crushing burden. How could someone just abandon their family like that? And how had no one else stepped in to help? "You've been taking care of your mom and sisters all by yourself?" Richard asked, his voice low with disbelief. Timmy nodded, his gaze dropping back to his lap. "I try," he whispered, "but it's hard. I don't know how to do all the things my mom used to do. I can't make her better, and I can't make enough money to buy food. I go to school when I can, but most days I have to stay home and watch my sisters. If I don't, they'll be alone all day, and I'm scared something will happen to them." Richard felt a tightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. This boy, this child, was bearing responsibilities that would be overwhelming for most adults. And yet, here he was, sitting in a park, alone and unnoticed by the world, simply trying to survive. "Timmy," Richard began, his voice filled with both compassion and determination. "You don't have to do this on your own anymore. I'm going to help you. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to make sure you and your family get the help you need." Timmy looked up at him, his expression one of disbelief. It was clear that he wasn't used to kindness, especially from strangers. His lips trembled, and for a moment it seemed like he might start crying again, but he held it back. "Why would you help us?" Timmy asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "You don't even know me." Richard smiled softly, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "Because sometimes we all need a little help, and right now you need someone to help you. I may not know what it's like to be in your shoes, but I know I can do something. I want to." Timmy hesitated, clearly torn between hope and fear of disappointment. Richard couldn't blame him. After everything he had been through, it made sense that the boy would be wary of promises. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind picked up again, blowing more leaves across the park, swirling them around in a dance of golden brown. Richard could feel the cold creeping into his bones, but he didn't care. His focus was entirely on Timmy and the heartbreaking story he had just shared. "What are your sisters' names?" Richard asked, breaking the silence. "Lucy and Emma," Timmy replied, his voice quieter now. "Lucy's 9 and Emma's only 5. They don't really understand what's going on. I try to protect them from it, but..." His words trailed off, the weight of the situation too heavy to continue. Richard's mind was already racing, formulating a plan. He had resources, connections, things that could make a difference. But it wasn't just about throwing money at the problem. It was about making sure Timmy's family was taken care of in a way that would truly change their lives. "Listen," Richard said, placing a reassuring hand on Timmy's shoulder. "I want to help your mom and your sisters, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Timmy looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. He bit his lip, clearly wrestling with whether or not to believe this man who had appeared out of nowhere, offering salvation. But eventually he gave a small nod. "Okay," he whispered. "I trust you." Richard smiled, though his heart ached for the boy. "Good. Now let's get you home and see what we can do to help your family. You've been carrying this burden for too long, Timmy. You're not alone anymore." As Richard and Timmy drove through the dimly lit streets, the reality of the situation began to sink in even deeper. Richard's luxury sedan, with its pristine leather seats and smooth ride, felt like a world away from the hardships this boy faced. Outside, the scenery gradually shifted from well-maintained shops and houses to older, run-down buildings. The farther they went, the more Richard realized that this part of the city had been long forgotten by most of society, just like Timmy and his family. The car came to a halt in front of a house that Richard barely recognized as livable. It stood at the end of a narrow, crumbling street, framed by flickering streetlights. The house itself was small and dilapidated, its walls faded from years of neglect. The roof sagged in places, threatening to collapse under the weight of time. The windows were cracked, and the yard was little more than a patch of overgrown weeds, scattered with rusted toys and broken furniture. Richard had seen struggling families before, but this was beyond what he had expected. Timmy unbuckled his seatbelt with shaky hands and got out of the car, hesitating as he turned toward the house. Richard followed, his heart heavy as he braced himself for what awaited them inside. Timmy led the way, his footsteps slow, almost reluctant, as if ashamed to show his home to a man who lived in such wealth. When they reached the front door, Timmy glanced up at Richard for a brief moment, the weight of embarrassment clear in his eyes. He pushed the door open, and the first thing Richard noticed was the smell, a pungent mix of dampness and sickness that clung to the stale air like a heavy fog. The inside of the house was no better than the outside. The walls were stained with water damage, and the dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered sporadically, casting long shadows across the room. "This is where we live," Timmy said quietly, his voice barely audible. "It's not much, but it's all we have." Richard stepped inside, trying to mask the shock on his face. He had never seen such poverty up close. The living room was small and sparsely furnished, with a sagging couch in the center, covered by a thin, faded blanket. In one corner, two young girls huddled together, their faces peeking out from underneath the blanket. They were no older than 8 or 9, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity as they saw Richard. "These are my sisters, Lucy and Emma," Timmy said softly, nodding toward the girls. Lucy, the older of the two, had messy brown hair and large, expressive eyes. Emma, the youngest, clung to Lucy's side, her small fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. Neither of them spoke. They simply stared, as if trying to understand why a stranger had walked into their world of hardship. Richard's chest tightened as he looked at them. Their clothes were ragged, much like Timmy's, and it was clear that they had gone too many days without proper food. They looked fragile, as if the slightest gust of wind could knock them over. It was more than just poverty. It was the hopelessness in their eyes that haunted Richard. "And this is my mom," Timmy continued, leading Richard over to the corner of the room where an old mattress had been placed on the floor, serving as a makeshift bed. Lying on the mattress was a woman who looked far older than she should. Her skin was pale, her face gaunt, and her breathing labored. Her eyes fluttered open for a brief moment as they approached, but there was no strength left in her to speak. Richard knelt down beside the woman, his hand hovering uncertainly before he gently placed it on her arm. Her skin was cold and clammy, and her body was so thin that it seemed she hadn't eaten in days. She blinked up at him, her lips parting as if to say something, but no words came out. It was clear she was in the final stages of her illness. Whatever it was had consumed her completely. "She's been sick for a long time," Timmy said, his voice trembling. "We don't have the money to take her to a doctor. I tried to take care of her, but—" His voice broke and he turned away, unable to finish the sentence. Richard stood up slowly, his mind racing. The poverty wasn't just a lack of material goods. It was a suffocating force that had wrapped itself around this family, choking out any chance they had of surviving on their own. This wasn't a temporary struggle. It was a life they had been condemned to, with no way out. He looked at the small pile of clothes stacked in the corner, the empty shelves that should have held food, and the makeshift curtains hanging over the cracked windows. The house felt less like a home and more like a place where hope had died long ago. "How long has she been like this?" Richard asked, his voice heavy with concern. Timmy sniffled and wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "Months. It started small. She was just tired all the time. But then it got worse. Now she can't even get out of bed. I tried to make things better, but it's hard. I don't know what to do." Richard felt a wave of guilt wash over him. Here he was, a man who had more money than he knew what to do with, standing in front of a family that couldn't even afford basic medical care. It was a jarring contrast. The wealth he had accumulated through years of hard work and the crushing poverty that had trapped this family in a cycle they couldn't escape. But it wasn't just about the money. This was about humanity, about doing what was right when faced with suffering. Richard knew he couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't leave Timmy to shoulder the weight of this struggle on his own. "Timmy," Richard said, turning to the boy with a determined look in his eyes, "you've done more for your family than most people your age could ever imagine. But you don't have to do this alone anymore. I'm going to help you. I promise." Timmy looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Really?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Really," Richard replied. "But first, we need to get your mom to a doctor. She needs help now." The boy's eyes widened, and for the first time since they had met, Richard saw a flicker of relief cross his face. It was as if a tiny piece of the weight he had been carrying had finally been lifted. The days that followed Timmy's confession were a whirlwind for Richard, but they marked the beginning of a transformation, not only in Timmy's family, but also in Richard himself. As soon as Richard left the small house that evening, he couldn't shake the image of the frail woman lying helpless on the mattress, or the hollow looks in the children's eyes. It haunted him, the stark contrast between his life and theirs. That night, as he sat in his sprawling mansion, surrounded by art, luxury, and everything money could buy, it all felt empty. For the first time in his life, Richard found no comfort in his wealth. His mind kept returning to Timmy's small home, to the crumbling walls, the smell of dampness, and the way the children had huddled under that threadbare blanket. It gnawed at him, the stark injustice of it all. The next morning, Richard made his decision. He wasn't going to simply give them a bit of cash and disappear. He was going to be part of their lives, part of their healing. His first stop was a nearby grocery store, where he filled several carts with food, fresh vegetables, fruit, bread, milk, meat, and other essentials. It wasn't just about filling their bellies for the night. Richard wanted them to have more than enough for the days to come. When he arrived back at Timmy's house, the boy's eyes went wide with disbelief. He watched in awe as Richard carried bag after bag inside, filling their empty pantry and lining the fridge with food they hadn't seen in months. "Is this for us?" Timmy asked, still not fully believing that someone would care enough to do something like this. "All of it," Richard replied with a smile, placing the last bag on the kitchen counter. "And I'm not done yet." Richard's next visit brought medicine for Timmy's mother. He had arranged for a doctor to come and check on her, ensuring that she was getting the care she needed. The doctor prescribed some much-needed medication, and with each passing day, Richard could see a change in her. Though she was still weak, her once pale face began to regain some color, and the deep lines of pain around her eyes softened. As the days turned into weeks, Richard became a constant presence in Timmy's home. He helped the children with their homework, brought them toys, and even took them on small trips to parks or the zoo, places they had only heard about but never had the chance to visit. It was during these moments that Richard realized how much he had missed out on, not because of his wealth, but because he had been blind to the joys of giving, of truly connecting with others. One afternoon, as he sat in the living room with Timmy and his sisters, Lucy and Emma, laughter filled the house, a sound that had been missing for far too long. Emma, the youngest, was curled up on his lap, clutching a small teddy bear he had bought her, while Lucy showed him the drawings she had made at school. "These are beautiful, Lucy," Richard said, holding up a particularly colorful drawing of a house surrounded by flowers and trees. "You have a real talent." Lucy blushed and ducked her head, not used to receiving compliments, but Richard could see the spark of pride in her eyes. It was moments like this that made him realize the impact he was having on their lives, and the impact they were having on his. But it wasn't just the children who were changing. Their mother, Sarah, was slowly regaining her strength. She still had a long road ahead, but with the medical care Richard had arranged and the proper nutrition she was now getting, the improvement was undeniable. She no longer looked like a shadow of herself, and though her movements were slow and careful, there was hope in her eyes. One evening, as Richard was preparing to leave after another visit, Sarah called him over. She had been resting on the couch, watching as he played with her children, her heart full of gratitude. "Mr. Langston," she said softly, her voice still weak but much stronger than before. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You've given us more than just food or medicine. You've given us a second chance." Richard smiled and shook his head. "You don't need to thank me, Sarah. You've raised incredible children. It's the least I can do to help." But Sarah's gaze held his, and there was something deeper in her expression, something that made Richard pause. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. "You're a wealthy man. You could have walked away and never looked back. Why us?" Richard considered her question for a moment, his mind racing back to the moment he had first seen Timmy on that park bench, crying his heart out, lost and alone. He thought of the life he had led, filled with material success but devoid of real connection. "I didn't realize how empty my life was," Richard admitted, his voice quiet. "I had everything, money, power, luxury, but none of it meant anything. Not really. Meeting Timmy, meeting your family, it made me see things differently. There's more to life than just what we own. It's about the people we help, the connections we make. You've given me something I never knew I was missing." Sarah smiled softly, tears welling up in her eyes. "You've given us hope," she said, her voice barely a whisper. As the days passed, Richard's involvement in Timmy's family grew deeper. He helped Timmy's mother find a job she could do from home, one that didn't strain her still fragile health, but allowed her to contribute to the family once again. He made sure the children had new clothes, shoes, and school supplies. And little by little, the dilapidated house they lived in began to transform as well. Richard arranged for repairs to the roof, new windows to replace the cracked ones, and even a small garden in the front yard for Lucy and Emma to tend. The neighborhood began to take notice too. Timmy's home, once the most rundown on the street, was slowly becoming a symbol of hope for the entire community. Neighbors who had kept to themselves began offering to help, and soon a sense of unity began to form where there had once been isolation. But the most important change of all was the one inside Richard. His heart had softened, his outlook on life forever altered. He no longer measured his success by the zeros in his bank account or the luxury he surrounded himself with. Instead, he found fulfillment in the simple joy of seeing Timmy and his family thrive, in knowing that he had made a real difference in their lives. One evening, as the sun set over the now repaired house, Richard sat on the front porch with Timmy beside him. The air was filled with the sweet scent of freshly planted flowers, and the sounds of Lucy and Emma giggling inside floated out through the open windows. "I don't know how to ever thank you, Mr. Langston," Timmy said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You saved us." Richard looked down at the boy, his heart swelling with pride and affection. "You don't need to thank me, Timmy. You've taught me something far more valuable than money ever could. You've shown me what it means to truly care for others." Timmy smiled, his eyes bright with hope. And for the first time since Richard had met him, the weight of the world no longer seemed to rest on his small shoulders. Months had passed since Richard first met Timmy, but it felt like a lifetime had unfolded in that short span. The small, dilapidated house at the end of the crumbling street was no longer a place of sorrow or despair. It had transformed into a home filled with laughter, warmth, and hope, a reflection of the changes that had taken place within the family who lived there. Timmy's mother, Sarah, was now a shadow of the woman Richard had first encountered, frail, gaunt, and consumed by illness. With consistent medical care and nutritious food, her recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. Though she still moved slowly, her once pallid skin now glowed with health. She had regained her strength enough to begin working again, in a job Richard had helped her secure, one that she could manage from the comfort of home. The job wasn't glamorous, but it allowed her to provide for her family, bringing with it a sense of pride that no amount of charity could replace. One morning, as Richard pulled up in his sleek black car to visit, Sarah greeted him with a warm smile, standing at the front door, a sight he once thought impossible. The house had been repaired, its sagging roof now restored, the cracked windows replaced with clean, sturdy panes. The yard, once overrun with weeds, was now home to a small garden tended by Lucy and Emma, who had taken a keen interest in growing flowers and vegetables. Richard stepped out of the car and was met with the sound of laughter. The girls were running around the yard, chasing each other, their giggles filling the air like music. Inside, the house buzzed with life, a stark contrast to the dark, cold atmosphere it once held. Timmy, who had once been a small, scared boy, burdened by the weight of the world, was now standing taller, more confident. His shoulders were no longer hunched from the weight of responsibility. He had transformed into the protective older brother he had always wanted to be, but never had the strength to fully embrace. Now, he was a young man filled with hope and determination, someone Richard could hardly recognize from that first fateful meeting on the park bench. As Timmy walked up to greet Richard, his face broke into a wide smile. "Mr. Langston, I didn't know you were coming today." His voice was filled with joy, a sound Richard had grown to cherish. Richard patted him on the back, proud of the boy he had come to care for so deeply. "I wanted to check on you and your family. Make sure everything's going well. How's school going?" Timmy's smile grew wider, and there was a gleam of excitement in his eyes. "It's great. I'm doing well in my classes, and I'm even thinking about joining the soccer team. I think I'm good enough now." Richard raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Soccer, huh? That's fantastic. I'll have to come see one of your games. The mention of soccer brought a renewed spark to Timmy's face. It was amazing how much the boy had changed. Gone was the timid child who cried alone on a bench, unsure of how to care for his sisters. In his place stood a confident young man who was eager to chase his dreams. Inside, Lucy and Emma were equally transformed. Lucy, the shy girl who had once clung to her brother in fear, was now a bright and energetic child, full of life and curiosity. She showed Richard the drawings she had been working on, her artistic talent blossoming now that she no longer had to worry about where her next meal would come from. Emma, the youngest, ran up to Richard, laughing as she tugged at his pant leg, asking him to join their game of tag. Okay, you got me," Richard laughed, scooping Emma into his arms as she giggled uncontrollably. It was a joy that Richard never thought he would experience, the joy of being part of a family, even if not by blood. He had grown to love them all, each child, each smile, each moment of joy that he had helped bring back into their lives. But the biggest change had been in Richard himself. The once hard-hearted businessman, who measured success by the size of his bank account, had found a deeper meaning in life. No longer did he spend his days chasing deals or attending high society events just to prove his worth. Now his time was devoted to this family and to the connections that had become more precious than any material wealth he had once coveted. Timmy's family had taught him that true wealth wasn't measured in money or status, but in the relationships you built and the impact you had on the lives of others. One afternoon, as the family gathered around the dinner table, the house was filled with the smell of home-cooked food, another sign of Sarah's growing health and strength. Richard joined them for a meal, as he often did these days. The table was full of chatter, laughter, and the clinking of dishes. It was a simple scene, but for Richard, it was more beautiful than any grand event or luxurious vacation. After dinner, as the sun began to set, Richard found himself on the front porch with Sarah. She leaned back in her chair, watching the girls play in the yard, her expression peaceful. "I never thought we'd make it to this point," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "There were times when I thought we wouldn't survive. But you saved us." Richard looked at her, feeling a warmth in his chest that he had never known before. "No, Sarah, you saved yourselves. I just helped you see that it was possible." Sarah smiled at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've given us so much more than just food or money. You gave us hope. You gave us a chance to rebuild our lives." Richard shook his head, humbled by her words. "I think you've given me more than I could ever give you. Before I met Timmy, I thought I had everything, but I didn't realize how empty my life really was until you and your family came into it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in a soft golden glow. The sound of the girls' laughter echoed through the air, mingling with the chirping of birds. It was a moment of pure peace, a reflection of the new life they had all built together. The next few months brought even more changes. Richard continued to be a part of their lives, helping where he could, but also giving the family the space to stand on their own 2 feet. Timmy's mother regained her health and was able to take on more work, while the children thrived in school, their futures brighter than ever before. One day, as Richard watched Timmy playing soccer with his friends, he felt a deep sense of pride. The boy who had once sat on that bench, crying in despair, was now leading his team with confidence and joy. It was a transformation that went beyond just survival. Timmy and his family were thriving, and so was Richard. The bond they had formed was unbreakable. Timmy's family had become a part of Richard's life, not out of obligation or charity, but out of genuine love. And in the process, Richard had discovered that true wealth came not from what you had, but from what you gave to others. As he watched Timmy score the winning goal, the crowd erupting in cheers, Richard smiled to himself. His journey had come full circle. The man who once thought he had everything had finally found what he had been missing all along. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and share any themes or ideas you'd like to hear in future stories. Your feedback means the world to me. Thanks for watching.